Hey everyone, it's Natalie Bencavanga, and welcome to Facts Over Fear, the July 4th edition. So, when was the last time that you actually thought about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States? If you're like me, you're probably thinking about it more than you ever have before, considering the state of the world. And how much do you really know past your high school history class? With another Independence Day fast approaching into clear view, and of course, it being a very special one, the 250th year of this country's birth, it is safe to say that America's founding and founding members have become almost a type of mythology and folklore for many Americans. So why does that matter? So here to discuss that is Thomas Richards Jr., a Philadelphia-based historian, beloved history teacher at Springfield Chestnut Hill Academy, and author of a new myth-busting book, also turned into a high school performance/play, The Unfinished Business of 1776, Why the American Revolution Never Ended. I love that title. Thomas, thank you so much for being here with me.
Thanks for having me, Natalie.
Absolutely. So guys, just so you know, I get a lot of press releases that come across my desk, and every now and then one of them makes me go, that could be interesting. And this was definitely one of them, because when I saw this book, The Unfinished Business of 1776, I thought, well, that is an intriguing title. So kudos to you for pulling me in. But can you talk a little bit about what inspired this work?
Sure. I think Americans, or most Americans, consider the American Revolution kind of long gone, that this is this single moment in our past where Americans declared their independence from Great Britain and won it, and kind of then it was over. And there wasn't really a struggle over the meaning of America, or that struggle came much later. And one of the things that that kind of stereotype, or that understanding, is just not true. The American Revolution was a revolution for a reason, that people thought they were overturning existing society. It wasn't just to kick out the British, although that was one of the most, or maybe the most important thing. They're thinking about things like abolition of slavery, or women's rights, or economic equality, or a bunch of other things. And when the revolution ends, a lot of Americans look around and they say, it's great we're independent, but we thought the revolution mattered more than this, or means more to us than just independence. And so the book really goes into the different struggles that begin basically as soon as the ink is dry in the Constitution, to get more rights for certain groups of people, to follow through on what certain Americans think are the ideals of the revolution that have not been totally fulfilled. And so sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, I find that so fascinating because, when I think of the founding fathers, I mean, many of them had, enslaved people. George Washington in particular, stands out as part of that. And then I know I've read a lot of things that there was a lot of infighting among them. But if you look at them as a collective, the guys in that room were all white, all male, and of a certain, economic bracket, so to speak. So where was all of this tension that you're talking about? Because I'm not seeing it when I'm imagining that room exactly.
So you brought up slavery, which is often called the original sin of the founding fathers, the original sin
Mm-hmm.
of America. And when my book dives into, there's multiple chapters on slavery. Uh, Slavery, because of the American Revolution, because Jefferson writes these words about life, everyone having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because Americans are talking about freedom. Well, many people are saying, well, what about enslaved people? Enslaved people themselves are saying this. And so, as early as 1776, enslaved people and their allies start using things like the Declaration of Independence to push for anti-slavery measures. And so, in 1776, slavery is everywhere across the 13 colonies. Slavery is from New Hampshire all the way down to Georgia. And because of the revolution, and because the founding fathers and really just regular Americans in northern colonies kind of buy this idea of liberty, there ends up being this anti-slavery movement that really does some amazing things in the North. There's gradual abolition laws. Slavery is not usually abolished overnight, but by the early 1800s, the North is an anti-slavery territory. That's the only place in all North and South America where that's true. And that's only because of the American Revolution. And so in the South, things are a little different where they will talk about liberty and usually then kind of turn their back on anti-slavery rhetoric. But there is no free North without the American Revolution.
Let's talk a little bit about women's rights in all of this too. I can't, and I'm sorry, you're the history teacher, so I'm going to defer to you, but I can't remember which founding father's wife said, don't forget about the women. But I remember that quote specifically.
It was
So
Abigail Adams. Remember the ladies.
thank you. Thank you. Remember the ladies. Can you talk a little bit about the sentiments around that as well?
Women are at the forefront of the American Revolution. So when Americans are boycotting British goods, who's in
Mhm.
charge of really the boycotts? It's women. Their job is they're the consumers. Their job is to buy things for the family in 1776. So their buy-in is crucial to make these boycotts work. And
Mhm.
then they will create these organizations called Daughters of Liberty, and they will get together and weave what they call homespun, which are locally made cloth so they don't buy British goods. And so all of this, and then when the war starts, women are basically have to make sure the families survive through these when men go fight. Many that will follow men into battle at a place like Valley Forge. There will be more than 1,000 women are there
Mhm.
through the winter. We don't usually talk about that. And
Mhm.
so during and after the revolution, this idea of women's rights is out there, and they will use the phrase "the rights of women." Now they're not talking. What's important to recognize is that 250 years ago, neither men nor women are necessarily talking about the right to vote. But
Mhm.
they are talking about things like the right to own property in marriage or
Mhm.
the right to
Mhm.
be free of domestic abuse. So one of the things that's important, I think, that my book tries to show is that 250 years ago is in some ways a very short amount of time, but it's also a very long amount of time. And so certain things, anti-slavery, women's rights, they had it. It was there present at the founding. It
Mhm.
doesn't always mean exactly what we mean today when we talk about those things.
Well, I think that makes sense within the context of the era. There were these ideas starting to simmer and like you said, they were moving at different rates and at different speeds with, slavery being abolished at a much faster rate than sort of women's rights being acknowledged in a public sense. Where did indigenous people play into this? Because, also, I mean, my gosh, on the one hand, it's like you had all these people colonizing these spaces that some were living coexisting with indigenous communities. Others were really being pushed out. And then, of course, you had the government, once it started to grow, be like, hey, we're really going to start pushing these natives out of their homelands. What was the tension like there when the founding fathers were thinking about this new nation? And how did that play into it, the indigenous communities?
So one of the chapters of my book dives into this subject very deeply. Uh,
Hmm.
Indigenous people. I mean, yeah, I would argue that the revolution, probably the biggest blind spot of the revolution, is Indigenous people,
Hmm.
even more so than slavery.
Hmm.
Uh, but part of the reason there's this blind spot is that Indigenous people are seen as outside the United States. They are separate nations. So when things like the Declaration of Independence are written and the Constitution is drafted, Indigenous people are basically, they're referred to in the Constitution as Indians not taxed. In the Declaration of Independence, they're referred to as merciless Indian savages, which is incredibly racist. It also reflects the fact that, in general, for very logical reasons, they're allying with the British because they don't want their lands taken. Um, what's really interesting is that um, there's all these treaties signed with Indigenous people. And what happens over the course of I think most people know this general story. It's not really the government that is usually taking indigenous lands. It's regular Americans, white Americans on the ground who are moving
Hmm.
into these places. And what ends up happening kind of time and again is that even though the government will have a treaty with an indigenous nation, eventually, if there's several hundred or several thousand white settlers, they're gonna side with the white settlers, even if it's the white settlers who basically broke the law. What my book goes into is that during the era of Indian removal in the 1820s and 30s, when a bunch of tribes or nations is a better word for them, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, they're there in the Southeast, kind of surrounded by white Americans, and Andrew Jackson and local Georgians and Arkansans, they want their land, uh, and there's this huge pushback against this because of basically the American Revolution. There's this huge anti-removal movement that basically says, we're better than this, Americans. We're better than this. We promise this. We need to uphold our treaties from 1776. It's the tragic story is that it ultimately fails. It fails by basically two or three votes in Congress. But it ends up then spawning kind of the radical abolition movement. But really, the fact that thousands of Americans will get on this bandwagon is a testament to how much the American Revolution means to them. They think they're better than what the United States is doing.
That's so interesting because I always talk about how the collective needs to be sort of better or more ethical or more high-minded in a sense than the individual. And so that sort of reflects that ideology too of we have to build something better if we're going to do something together than any one person would do alone, right? And so that's fascinating. Okay, so we've touched on sort of the history of these things. I want to talk a little bit about the religious freedom and that aspect to it, because obviously, yes, there were people that were seeking religious freedom for their extreme religious beliefs or non-religious beliefs. I know there were atheists as well that came over to the United States looking for, well, it wasn't the United States then, to the New World, looking for a space to be. How did that factor in when they were deciding what this document, what this founding nation was going to look like when you had a lot of opposing views, I'm assuming, on religion?
Because there were so many opposing views on religion, because each colony had its congregational churches in New England, back to the Puritans, its Anglicans in Virginia, in Pennsylvania and New York. It's an incredibly diverse set of religious beliefs, mostly Christian, but Christians who really, really disagreed with each other and didn't necessarily like each other.
Mhm.
Because there's so much religious diversity, the framers of the Constitution and basically most Americans recognize that having some sort of national religion, like a state church, is incredibly problematic. And so religious liberty is there basically from the start. And in the Bill of Rights promises everyone has a right in the First Amendment has a right to their own beliefs. And many states then follow through. I think the last state is maybe Connecticut in the 1830s or Massachusetts that ends up getting rid of a state-sponsored church, but most are very right early after the Revolution. What's really interesting is that you hear kind of the right push religion, and we need to be more religious. Uh, the reason that religion has flourished in this country, more so than Europe, there are more religious people in the United States than Europe, is because of this religious diversity. Because people can pick and choose what they want. Because some historians have called it kind of a spiritual marketplace. All the way back to 250 years ago, it's almost like spiritual, in some ways capitalism. That might sound too negative, but right, religion these churches have to sell themselves, and
Mhm.
they're dynamic and they change, and they're not just based on money through the state. And what the irony is, in the last 20 years, 50 years, and the religious right has seen we need to push religion on people through the government. It's bad in some ways. It's bound to backfire. I don't know anybody who's if you hang up the Ten Commandments in a schoolroom, that
Yeah.
all of these that 15-year-old kids, and I believe them, I know them well, their first reaction is probably gonna say, "Well, I'm not listening to anything on the walls of this classroom. I'm not trusting these adults." There there's the truth. If you want to foster religion, then let people be religious in their own way.
I love that. And if you're just joining us, I'm chatting with Thomas Richards Jr. He is the author of Unfinished Business of 1776 and Breakaway Americas. He's also a history teacher at Springside Chestnut Hill in Philadelphia. I just want everybody to understand the reference to the 15-year-olds. I want to touch on that a little bit more because I think what's so interesting about this nation, and maybe it's because of how we were founded, is America is kind of ungovernable in that way. Like it's really hard to get things done. It's really hard to get people on the same page. And so I do find it interesting that we have this sort of rise of Christian nationalism happening right now in the United States. I know you said a little bit about this already about, this sort of idea that it could really backfire, but why do you think the people in power right now are trying to use sort of this originalism and these conversations around our founding fathers as a reason for pushing basically state sanctioned religion when you basically just said, I mean, these things are in opposition philosophically to one another.
I think the use of originalism has become a tool. I think originalism as a kind of a way to understand the Constitution has a certain logic to it, where
Mhm.
if there it was written 250 years ago, we should figure out what people 250 years ago meant. The problem with that viewpoint is that they meant many different things. They constantly disagreed with each other. There most things that come before something like the Supreme Court, there were a wide variety of opinions 250 years ago about what that meant at the time, or it wasn't even discussed at the time, and it wasn't even in the kind of the conception of how people thought. And so it ends up in some ways, originalism started as, like many things, it started as a kind of logical, intelligent way to sell a certain viewpoint. But it's one of those things where if you dive into it and you really kind of pull it apart, it ends up falling apart. Because that idea, there was no original interpretation about most of these things. And so it ends up being a political tool.
Wow, mind blown. See, this is why I love having conversations with teachers because there's such a deeper understanding when you've been, absorbing this material and looking at it for so many angles for so long. I wanted to talk about the Constitution as a document that is one of the oldest in the world, I believe. So when you look at that, I did an event a couple of years ago, Thomas, where there was a debate on the stage where it was basically, do we keep the Constitution and amend it, or do we throw it out and start over? When you think of that debate and you think, like you said, that there's never really been a consensus on this document, why do you think it's been able to last then as long as it has without a regime or someone saying, "Hey, we're going to throw this out and start all over again"? And do you think that would be to benefit?
I the reason I mean, I think the kind of constitution worship in some ways is a more modern phenomenon. They weren't worshiping the Constitution in 1861 when there was the Civil War, right? The worst war in all of American history.
Mhm.
There was profound disagreements about what the Constitution meant. I think it's a more recent idea that this is some sort of moment, this sanctified moment that made America perfect forever. And of course, the people who were writing the Constitution knew there were going to be changes, and that's why they put in place things like the ability to amend. On your question of kind
Mhm.
of, do we need a new constitution or not? Um, I think it's too early to say we need. I recognize there are scholars and activists, people who say this document is incredibly conservative. It is difficult to change. I think there are some really valid points to think about how we would go about creating a new constitution, and I think we would do something like happened 250 or 240 years ago, where there's like state conventions and things like that. I don't think I think there's certain things in the Constitution that we have not kind of traditions have arisen that are not what the Constitution intended. So the
Mhm.
idea of the filibuster that requires 60 votes in the Senate, that's an incredibly anti-democratic way to pass things. Uh,
Mhm.
Gerrymandering, um, the idea that we need 9 Supreme Court justices. There were at times in history there was 6. I think we went up to 15 at one point. It's always been
Mhm.
in a political position. Um, there's no reason why a new administration cannot put more Supreme Court justices on there, and there's also no reason why the legislative branch can't rein in the Supreme Court. That there are mechanisms in the Constitution to do these things that we have
Mhm.
just not accessed in quite some time. When I think the things were much more fluid and it's kind of become stultified. So there's once we start to do those things, if a new Congress can do those things, then maybe this will look like a more democratic document. It is a fundamentally there are anti-democratic measures in the Constitution, but there are ways to push back on many of them that haven't been used in recent memory.
Do you think that's partly because there were some people that were a part of this process that were still sympathetic to Britain or at least to the idea of a king? Or do you think that that's just because no one could really agree on anything and this is what came out?
So the in terms of the Constitution, so this is the Declaration of Independence is in 1776, and that's everyone who signs it is down for separating from Britain. And
Then
you
it's
well, you
like,
know
but now
it
what?
yeah. The Constitution comes 11 years later when the first governing document of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, just really does not work out very well. It has 13
Mhm,
states. They're all kind of doing their own thing. They each have one vote. There's no executive power. There's no judicial power. And so the framers of the Constitution get together to create a new document. And um, the Constitution ends up being those people who did that were, for their time, in some ways more conservative. They
mhm,
see kind of the excesses of the states and they want to rein in a kind of, I guess you could call it democracy. Many of them were anti small d democratic. 250 years ago, democracy for many of these people is seen as the mob rule. And they look
mhm.
at places like we celebrate the Athenian democracy as kind of this great moment. And they were looking back and talking about it all the time and say, they tore themselves apart and they killed Socrates, right? We need to put stopgaps in place to get representation that then, if the people choose wrong, we can go somewhere else. That's why the Electoral College exists. That's why the Senate was originally chosen through state legislatures. It wasn't chosen per state, like by popular elections. It was only the House of Representatives that was chosen directly by the people. So those things, there has been more democratic, kind of small d democratic change when it comes to many of those things. But the people writing the Constitution they would not have called themselves Democrats, small d Democrats. They would call themselves small r Republicans,
Mhm.
represent government, but not. And that changes over the first 50 years, where people push back and make the country far more democratic than it was.
So what I'm getting at, what I'm hearing you get at, excuse me, is that this is not a stagnant document. This isn't a one and done. Things have continued over time. Since declaring our independence, things have continued to change because people change, because we see things, we go, that's not working. Let's change that. So when you had brought up the Electoral College, and I know this is just such a point of contention, especially in the last 20, 25 years. Where do you think the Electoral College is going to go in the future? Do you think there's a chance that it could be tossed aside and said this isn't relevant anymore because of the size of the nation? I'm sure when the founding fathers were working on the Constitution, I don't think anybody ever thought we'd be 300 million people at a certain point and able to find your news at the touch of a button. I mean, there's so many things that technology did that changed how we interact with our representatives. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a couple possibilities. There is that I'm forgetting the name, the voter compact that certain democratic states have passed this law where if I believe enough states pass it up to you'd have to get to 270 electoral votes, then these states would give their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. So it's a way to basically keep the electoral college but bypass what it means, because it's basically saying enough states are saying whoever wins the popular vote. That's one possibility. Another possibility is if Republicans end up um, basically getting screwed, but just like they win the popular vote but lose the electoral college, maybe you'll find finally some sort of consensus might come to
Hmm,
fruition. Right now, Republicans have no reason to compromise. They have
right.
two elections in the last 20 years where they've won despite losing the popular vote. So until something happens that gets them out of that mode of thinking, um, I mean, unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be um, change anytime soon. I think that's one that's going to be particularly difficult to change, but it can change. I mean,
Yeah,
that's one of the
sure.
things that's important to recognize.
Okay, some rapid fire kind of questions on where you think the founding fathers would have stood on these certain issues, or how we kind of got here. I'm thinking of abortion rights. I'm thinking of the fall of Roe. I'm thinking of, don't forget the ladies, that whole sentiment. How was the Constitution meant to handle though that issue? Because it clearly there's no conversation about abortion in our founding documents, because that was really not an area of thinking for government, and I'm assuming by those people, and yet we know it's become a political um motivator for many groups. So what are your thoughts on wrangling with that?
That's a Abortion is one of the issues where we're trying to figure out what original thinking was. it doesn't make any sense to do that because there wasn't actually thinking about that from a constitutional perspective.
Right.
250 years ago, women are basically in charge of their own healthcare. And midwives, instead of doctors, would have been kind of the assistants to that process.
Mhm.
Women weren't really considered pregnant until they could feel kicking. And so that's 22, 24 weeks of pregnancy.
Mhm.
Before that, it was called quickening, where if a woman was possibly pregnant, they would usually take some sort of medicinal remedy or whatever to basically what we would call today an abortion. They would
Sure.
not have thought of that as a
Right.
at the time. They were not even thinking of that as a child necessarily, like
Mhm.
pregnant. And so this idea that becomes a mid 19th century thing where
Mhm.
there's this movement where male doctors basically want to get in, kind of become in charge of pregnancy. And one of the things that's really interesting, and my book kind of argues, is that American Revolution was a moment in time where there was a lot of steps forward, but in that next 50 years, there were steps back. And so
Mhm.
there's kind of a counter revolution. And
Mhm.
so healthcare becomes more conservative by the mid 19th century than it ever was in 1776. So abortion, sorry, you said rapid fire. That was not rapid fire.
That's okay. I appreciate your candor and your willingness to discuss these with me. Okay, next one.
yeah, no
Let
original thinking on abortion.
Period.
Period.
Okay. Pun intended. So, next one
You said it, not
would
me. Got it.
next one would be gun rights because, we're seeing a lot of pushback from the government currently. They're very upset over people rioting or their perception of rioting or peaceful protesting. To me, this really goes hand in hand with gun rights and this idea. We always forget the second part of the well-organized militia. Talk a little bit about how that experience looking to today, how would the founding fathers align themselves with the Trump administration's take on all of these things, especially with ICE and these federal agents, taking people off the streets?
They're liberals and conservatives probably would have both hated the interpretation of gun rights 250 years ago because liberals would have hated the fact that most people were supposed to own a gun. There was supposed
Mhm.
to be a gun in every home, but most people were supposed to serve in the militia to protect the local community. This was not like we see like right wing militias, right, firing in fields, and we see like they're all dressed in camo. At the time, militia was a local community, or like think militia and jury duty were kind of two sides of the same coin. These were ways the community would participate in government to protect their own rights. And so sometimes I think when we look at what is in spirit of the Bill of Rights, something like what happened in Minnesota, the pushback against ICE, which is a local community organization, both kind of non-violently but also vigorously, enforcing their own community rules against an outside force. So I think that is far more in the spirit of the Second Amendment as the founding fathers intended it, and as really the people intended it 250 years ago than, say, the individual right to own a gun or these right wing militias.
I find this so fascinating. I'm so happy we're having this conversation. I'm so happy that I've gotten to connect with you because I'm definitely going to have you back on if you're game. There's so much more that we can chat about as we start to wrap up. I mean, my gosh, I took so many notes while you were talking, Thomas, but I want to end on something around the executive branch because to me, right now, we're approaching the 250th anniversary of this nation. I think it's a really interesting moment in the history of this country. We're really at a crossroads of who we want to be as a collective, as a people. Do we want to continue down this messy, winding road of democracy? Or do we want to turn to fascism for this quote unquote solution that to these problems that seem to be created by the people that are trying to solve them through fascism? But my question for you then is when we look at the executive branch and we look at the amount of power that has been consolidated through these executive orders. And yes, Donald Trump has absolutely done this, I think, leaps and bounds above other presidents, but he's certainly not the only president to use, I would say, excessive, executive orders to get things done. So when you think of that, when you think of the amount of power that a president has, was that the intent at the beginning when they were declaring their independence from Britain and then the subsequent documents that followed?
This was not their intent at all, and I completely agree with you that Donald Trump is by far the most trying to be gain the most amount of power as an executive. But this is a 75-year story where the president has gained more power at the expense of Congress. One of the consistent originalist thinkings, one of the few things they all agreed upon, that the Supreme Court ironically disagreed with this, is that a too powerful executive is a problem. That is why the revolution happened, because of there's a reason the list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence is against King George III. That
Mhm.
power in a single person is both dictatorial. It's also, frankly, kind of stupid. People who are talking about fascism lost. Hitler died in a bunker. Like when you have one person in charge and no one pushes back on that person, eventually bad decisions are made. I mean, you can see this in Russia with Ukraine, right? Putin, no one said to Putin, might not be the best idea. No one said to Trump, Iran might not be the best idea. And so the fact to kind of return to some things I don't want to return to 250 years ago, but in terms of getting the legislative branch to do its job, it's the first article in the Constitution. It's the longest one. It was seen as the most important. Instead of kind of getting on talking heads on various news programs, actually legislating. That's one way to restore kind of the original intention of the founding fathers of the revolution, and that's something I think is vital if we're going to save this democracy. And that could be from the left or it doesn't even matter Democrats, Republicans. Just legislative work
Mhm.
is incredibly important. Not these executive orders, they go away after 4 years because there's a new president.
Right.
Where you have durable change is legislation.
I just want to pull up a comment here from Josh Schrader, who says, "This is a great convo. I started American Experiments on Netflix. I've been thinking a lot about these themes." Well, Josh, if you're thinking about these themes, you should read Thomas's new book here, The Unfinished Business of 1776, Why the American Revolution Never Ended. Love that title so much. As we wrap, final question. You work with students, you're a high school teacher. I mean, we could do an entire show just on public education and the system and the importance of learning our history. But what are the things that you're seeing with your students right now? The ethical issues, the governmental issues, the questions that they ask you that are top of their mind as it pertains to our government and how it's operating.
I think the one thing I would say to adults who aren't in the classroom often is that students are far more capable of critical thinking and disagreement than we give them credit for. And I think that is there's this idea I think along both the right and the left that we need to teach a certain brand of American history. Either it was the greatest thing ever, or it was or it was a moment, the worst moment ever 250 years ago, and we sell that to our students. Students can understand that history is a debate. It's an argument about why and how things happened. And if students, they get into history it's not just facts and dates and people and
Mhm.
heroes and villains, but really messy, complicated stories. And I think students are capable of that. And I think we do them a disservice when we basically believe that we have to kind of teach this top-down history, this kind of tell them what happened and then they recite it. Uh, that doesn't serve them well, but it doesn't serve the country well. They are capable of doing this, and whatever happens in the next 50 years, the future is theirs. We should want them to be critically thinking about the American past and the present.
I appreciate you so much, Thomas. I have to say I loved school when I was growing up, and I in particular loved history class because I got to debate and argue all the time with everyone else. And I found that super fun and engaging. And I just so appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts and your incredible depth of knowledge around this area. I would absolutely love to have you back on so we can get into more conversation and talking points around this topic. Um, if people want to learn more about your work, if they'd like to read your book, where can they go?
I always want to support your local bookstore. You should be in your local bookstore. If you want to get it online, you can go to thenewpress.org and you put in the code 1776 the book and you can get it for 30% off. But it's also on Amazon and other websites. But But newpress.org, find the book, 1776, the book, and you get 30% off.
I think the founding fathers would have been in favor of your local bookstore. So we'll go with that.
I mean, that's my number to go support your local bookstores. Bookstores are more vital than ever. Reading is more vital than ever, particularly with all the technological changes in AI. I would say read, read, read.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody that joined. If you tuned in late, don't worry. This is going to go up on Substack, YouTube, and I'll have clips everywhere in the coming days. And until next time, everyone, take care of yourselves and each other. Thanks again, Thomas.
Thanks for having me, Natalie.